What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about leadership, government control, and global economies was missing a crucial piece? What if I said that centuries-old lessons, passed down from one of history's most influential political minds, could help us understand the economic instability and rising global tensions we see today? You're about to discover how the timeless ideas of Niccolò Machiavelli, yes, the author of The Prince, are more relevant today than ever before. In this video, we'll explore Machiavelli's profound insights into power and wealth, focusing on how his teachings about governance and statecraft are not just abstract theories, but practical strategies still being used in modern politics. We're talking about the kind of tactics that shape the actions of governments, businesses, and leaders across the globe. From Machiavelli's warnings about excessive generosity to his chilling advice on how to manipulate public perception, we'll examine the dangerous implications these tactics can have, especially in our current global economic crisis. As we go through today's content, I'll take you through a deep dive into the rising global debt, the tactics used by modern political leaders, and how these strategies, though centuries old, are still being employed today by some of the most influential figures in history. Whether it's politicians controlling public opinion through propaganda, the manipulation of wealth to consolidate power, or the alarming rise of hyperinflation, Machiavelli's lessons provide a hauntingly accurate roadmap for understanding the rise and fall of nations. But here's the catch: this isn't just a history lesson. What we're talking about is happening right now, and it affects all of us. The economic instability, the manipulation of resources, and the social unrest we see unfolding today are eerily similar to the scenarios Machiavelli wrote about centuries ago. Are we repeating the same mistakes? How can we use these insights to avoid a potential collapse? Stick with me as we break it all down. Before we dive into this deep and fascinating discussion, make sure you hit that like button if you love learning about these critical issues. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a thought-provoking video like this one. And share this with friends who need to hear these insights. It's time to start a conversation that could change the way we understand leadership and power. And if you want to help support the channel and keep these insightful videos coming, don't forget to donate through the super thanks button below. Your support means everything to us. Now, imagine this. What if the way we look at global power structures, governments, economies, and even our daily lives was shaped by strategies designed to keep us in the dark? Machiavelli warned us about the dangers of government overreach, excessive generosity, and the manipulation of resources to keep leaders in power. These concepts seem like they belong in the past, but they're alive and well in today's world. From hyperinflation to debt crises, we're seeing the very things Machiavelli feared play out on the world stage. So let's get started. Grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's unravel how these ancient teachings still shape the future of our world today. Niccolò Machiavelli remains one of the most influential figures in political thought, revered and reviled for his contributions to understanding power and leadership. Born in 1469 in Florence, Italy, Machiavelli was a product of the city-state's tumultuous political environment. Florence, during his time, was not a unified nation, but a collection of competing city-states, each with its own ruler, and the Medici family controlled the city. In this environment, Machiavelli was exposed early to the complexities of power dynamics, including the strategic use of diplomacy, warfare, and propaganda. Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, has sparked endless debates and discussions about the nature of power and the ethics of leadership. At its core, the book is a manual for rulers, advising them on how to acquire and maintain power by any means necessary. While The Prince was initially regarded as a blueprint for tyranny, its teachings have proven to be far more enduring, influencing not only tyrants and despots, but also modern political leaders, business executives, and even everyday people who seek to navigate the often murky waters of influence and control. Machiavelli's exploration of political power in The Prince can seem starkly pragmatic. The book offers no moral guidance, but focuses squarely on what works in the pursuit and maintenance of power. One of its most notorious lessons is that the ends justify the means, meaning that if a ruler needs to deceive, manipulate, or even kill to stay in power, they should do so without hesitation. This ruthless logic has made The Prince a controversial text, often seen as a guide to unscrupulous behavior. Despite its reputation, Machiavelli's work provides valuable insights into human nature, statecraft, and the mechanisms of power that are still relevant today, influencing not only political leaders but also corporate executives, religious leaders, and media moguls. To fully appreciate Machiavelli's impact on the modern world, it's important to understand the context in which he wrote. In 1502, at the age of 33, Machiavelli was appointed to the secretary of the Second Chancery in Florence. In this capacity, he was responsible for diplomatic missions, including negotiating alliances and gathering intelligence. He was sent on various missions across Europe, including observing the courts of Louis XII of France and Cesare Borgia, the infamous Italian nobleman. These missions gave him a first-hand look at how power worked behind the scenes. Through his travels, Machiavelli witnessed the pragmatism of rulers who wielded power not by virtue or morality, but through manipulation, coercion, and strategic alliances. The lessons Machiavelli learned in these courts, along with his deep knowledge of ancient Roman and Greek history, shaped his views on leadership and governance. Unlike the idealized visions of rulers as benevolent and just, Machiavelli saw them as practical figures who must navigate a world filled with treachery, betrayal, and shifting alliances. This view, while cynical, was grounded in a keen understanding of human nature and the dynamics of power. Machiavelli's writings on power are as relevant today as they were in his time. In a modern world, we see political leaders, business magnates, and even celebrities employing Machiavellian tactics to gain influence and control. Take, for example, the rise of modern populist leaders who use media manipulation, emotional appeal, and divisive rhetoric to galvanize support. These leaders often employ Machiavellian strategies by presenting themselves as men of the people, while engaging in actions that consolidate their power and eliminate rivals. The rise of social media has made it easier than ever for these leaders to manipulate public opinion, spreading carefully crafted messages to millions with just a few clicks. The same principles Machiavelli described centuries ago, appearance over substance, controlling information, and managing public perception, are now more potent than ever. Machiavelli's advice on power isn't limited to political figures. In the business world, leaders who want to maintain control of their companies often find themselves relying on similar tactics. A CEO might engage in strategic alliances, control the narrative through public relations, or use aggressive tactics to suppress competition. The business world is full of Machiavellian moves, from cutting deals behind closed doors to leveraging personal influence over stakeholders. Whether it's in politics, business, or entertainment, Machiavelli's principles of power have been adapted to fit the needs of those who seek control in our modern age. Furthermore, Machiavelli's ideas about how to deal with dissent and opposition continue to resonate in modern times. In The Prince, he advises rulers to crush opposition ruthlessly, ensuring that any challenge to their authority is swiftly eliminated. This view is echoed in the actions of modern authoritarian regimes, where leaders employ propaganda, surveillance, and military force to maintain their grip on power. In some cases, rulers use misinformation to delegitimize their opponents, just as Machiavelli suggested. In democratic societies, the manipulation of public opinion, though more subtle, still reflects Machiavellian tactics, with politicians using media and social platforms to sway voters and suppress inconvenient truths. Machiavelli also speaks to the importance of adaptability and pragmatism in leadership. He warns that a ruler must be able to change tactics depending on the situation, showing flexibility in their approach to power. This idea is seen in the shifting strategies of modern leaders who must navigate an ever-changing political landscape. A politician who was once seen as a champion of progressive policies may find it necessary to shift to more conservative stances in order to retain power in the face of changing public opinion or political realities. In business, leaders often have to pivot their strategies to respond to market shifts, new competitors, or unforeseen crises. While Machiavelli's work is often associated with ruthless ambition, it also offers valuable lessons on leadership, strategy, and human nature. The concept of virtue in The Prince, for example, suggests that leaders must possess the ability to shape their destiny, controlling the variables that are within their power. It's not just about being ruthless, it's about having the foresight and ability to read the political landscape and act accordingly. This concept has practical applications in modern leadership, where decision-makers must constantly assess and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Machiavelli's ideas about the use of power and control also extend to the realm of propaganda. In The Prince, he emphasizes the importance of controlling the narrative, shaping how the ruler is perceived by the public. This is especially relevant today in an age where media, from television to social media platforms, plays a central role in shaping public opinion. Political leaders and public figures have learned to use media effectively, creating a controlled image of themselves that aligns with the needs of the moment. Through the use of sound bites, advertisements, and social media posts, modern leaders carefully craft their public personas, just as Machiavelli advised rulers to do centuries ago. What is particularly striking about Machiavelli's work is how it transcends time and continues to offer a lens through which we can analyze power in the modern world. Whether it's through the manipulative tactics of today's political leaders or the cutthroat competitiveness of the business world, the principles laid out in The Prince continue to shape the dynamics of power. Machiavelli's work reminds us that power is often a game of perception, strategy, and manipulation, and that the rules of this game have not changed all that much in 500 years. As controversial as Machiavelli's work is, its relevance in today's world cannot be denied. The tactics he described in The Prince are still used by leaders, business executives, and others who seek to gain and maintain power. By understanding Machiavelli's principles, we can gain a better understanding of the dynamics of modern leadership and the ways in which power continues to shape the world around us. What Machiavelli wrote over 5 centuries ago remains a powerful and enduring guide to understanding the complexities of power, manipulation, and control in our world today. Niccolò Machiavelli was born on May 3, 1469, in the city of Florence, Italy, a place that was both a cultural hub and a political battlefield. His early life was shaped by the intellectual and political environment of this city-state, a microcosm of the complex, often volatile politics that would later inform his writings. His father, Bernardo di Niccolò Machiavelli, was a lawyer, not of significant wealth, but enough to ensure that Niccolò would receive a classical education. Growing up in such an environment, Machiavelli was exposed to the rich intellectual traditions of ancient Rome and Greece, which were central to his education and would later play a crucial role in the development of his political philosophy. Machiavelli's education was steeped in what was known as studia humanitatis, or the studies of humanity. This was an educational framework that focused on the classical subjects of rhetoric, grammar, philosophy, history, and poetry. The goal was to shape young men into public figures who could participate in civic life and contribute to society. In a way, this educational tradition prepared them not just for scholarly pursuits, but for leadership roles. Machiavelli was trained in Latin, a critical language for understanding ancient texts, and studied the works of the great Roman and Greek philosophers and historians. Figures such as Cicero, Aristotle, and Livy were central to his education, providing him with a foundation for understanding human nature, governance, and power dynamics. This classical education was crucial for Machiavelli's later work as a political theorist. Unlike the humanistic tradition that emphasized ethics and virtue in leadership, Machiavelli's studies led him to a more pragmatic view of politics, one grounded in the realities of power and statecraft. His education did not merely concern itself with moral philosophy. It was also about practical political knowledge. Machiavelli was taught to be an observer of human nature and the machinations of political life, which would come to the forefront in his later writings. The context in which Machiavelli lived and learned was equally influential. The political climate of Florence during the late 15th century was marked by instability, intrigue, and constant power struggles. Florence was not the unified Italy that it is today. Instead, it was a city-state surrounded by other powerful and independent city-states, each governed by its own ruler or family. Florence, for most of Machiavelli's early life, was under the rule of the Medici family, a wealthy and powerful dynasty that had accumulated its wealth through banking and commerce. The Medici family's influence on Florence was profound. Under their patronage, Florence flourished as a center of art, culture, and learning. The city became synonymous with the Renaissance, a period of remarkable intellectual and artistic achievement. Florence was home to great artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Sandro Botticelli, whose works would go on to define the cultural legacy of the Renaissance. However, despite this cultural brilliance, the political environment in Florence was far from stable. The Medici family's rule, though marked by prosperity, was also characterized by corruption, manipulation, and authoritarianism. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the ruler of Florence during much of Machiavelli's early life. Lorenzo was a charismatic and highly intelligent leader who governed Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492. His reign was a period of both cultural and political brilliance, but also marked by his increasingly despotic rule. While he was celebrated for his patronage of the arts and his role in making Florence a cultural center of the Renaissance, Lorenzo's rule was also seen by many as oppressive. He was accused of using his wealth and influence to manipulate the political system, ensuring that his family remained in control. His authoritarian leadership created a political atmosphere that was ripe for Machiavelli's later reflections on power. Lorenzo's death in 1492 set off a chain of events that dramatically altered the political landscape of Florence. In the years following his death, the Medici family's grip on power weakened. The city-state descended into political chaos, with factions vying for control. By 1494, the Medici were expelled from Florence, and the city briefly became a republic. This shift in power created the political environment in which Machiavelli would rise to prominence. At the age of 29, Machiavelli was appointed as the secretary to the Second Chancery, a position that involved managing diplomatic correspondence and overseeing the city's territorial matters. His role soon expanded when he was made secretary to the Ten of War, a group responsible for foreign relations and military matters. It was in these roles that Machiavelli began his career in politics, quickly gaining a reputation for his intelligence, energy, and keen understanding of diplomacy. His early career exposed him to the intricacies of power, warfare, and diplomacy. And it was through this first-hand experience that he began to formulate his ideas about statecraft and leadership. In addition to the political turmoil and shifting allegiances of Florence, Machiavelli was influenced by the broader political situation in Italy. At this time, Italy was a fragmented collection of city-states, with each city-state ruled by different families or factions. The constant conflict between these states, along with foreign interference from powers like France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, meant that Italy was a battleground for political intrigue. The competition for control over these states, the use of military force, and the manipulation of alliances were all common features of political life. It was in this context that Machiavelli developed a more cynical and pragmatic view of politics, one that saw power as a zero-sum game in which rulers were constantly competing for dominance. Machiavelli's time in power came to an abrupt end in 1512 when the Medici family regained control of Florence. Machiavelli was ousted from his position, imprisoned, and later exiled to his family's estate. It was during this period of exile that he began writing his most famous works, including The Prince. The personal and political upheaval he experienced likely influenced his outlook on power, leadership, and the volatility of politics. Florence's political environment and the dramatic shifts in power that Machiavelli witnessed throughout his life profoundly shaped his political philosophy. His education in the classics, combined with his first-hand experiences in diplomacy and warfare, gave him a unique perspective on the mechanisms of power. Unlike other thinkers of his time who focused on idealistic concepts of virtue and morality in leadership, Machiavelli was interested in the practicalities of ruling. His writings reflect his belief that power often requires harsh and calculated measures, including manipulation, deception, and violence. These ideas, rooted in his education and experiences, would go on to make him one of the most influential and controversial political thinkers in history. Niccolò Machiavelli's political career in Florence unfolded during a time of immense turbulence and intrigue. Having come from a relatively modest background, Machiavelli was educated in the classical traditions of Florence, but his future in politics was shaped by the volatile political environment that characterized the city. Florence, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was not a unified nation-state as Italy is today, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each ruled by its own set of power dynamics. The city's politics were influenced by powerful families, shifting alliances, and external threats. This atmosphere was ripe for a young and ambitious individual like Machiavelli to emerge and make his mark in public life. By the time he was in his late 20s, Machiavelli found himself thrust into the political scene in Florence, largely due to his sharp intellect, strong work ethic, and the emerging opportunity that came with the city's fluctuating political status. In 1494, the Medici family, long dominant in Florence, were exiled after the French king, Charles VIII, invaded Italy. This created a vacuum of power, which paved the way for the establishment of the Florentine Republic. The political landscape was shifting, and Florence was looking for new leadership and organizational structures. It was against this backdrop that Machiavelli entered public service. At the age of 29, Machiavelli was appointed as secretary to the Second Chancery in 1498, a significant public office in the newly established Florentine Republic. The Second Chancery was responsible for managing correspondence and overseeing diplomatic relations concerning the city's territories. This position allowed him to engage directly in the administration of Florence's political affairs and, more importantly, to observe firsthand the nuances of statecraft. As secretary, Machiavelli began writing reports and drafting documents related to Florence's foreign relations, which required him to understand the complex political and military landscape of Europe at the time. He was no longer a mere observer of Florence's politics, but an active participant in its affairs. His appointment did not stop there. Just a few years later, Machiavelli was appointed to a more prominent position as secretary to the Ten of War. The Ten of War was a powerful body in Florence, tasked with overseeing the city's military and foreign policies. As a key member of this group, Machiavelli was responsible for advising on military matters, gathering intelligence, and negotiating with foreign powers. His role required him to travel extensively, meet with political and military leaders, and form alliances, all of which provided invaluable experiences that shaped his views on power and leadership. Machiavelli's position with the Ten of War gave him a front-row seat to the complex world of diplomacy and military strategy. This exposure was critical in shaping his later writings, especially The Prince, in which he laid out his views on the acquisition and consolidation of power. During his time with the Ten, Machiavelli was directly involved in foreign negotiations, many of which would later inspire his analysis of statecraft and diplomacy. One of the key aspects of Machiavelli's approach to politics was his belief that power could be maintained and expanded through the strategic use of military force and diplomacy, two areas in which he had significant first-hand experience. The Florentine Republic was a constantly shifting entity, caught between internal divisions and external pressures. The city-state had to contend with the influence of neighboring powers such as the Papal States, France, and Spain. Machiavelli's work in the Ten of War often required him to negotiate alliances with foreign powers, gather intelligence on potential threats, and make strategic decisions that affected the survival of Florence. His diplomatic missions took him across Europe, where he met some of the most powerful figures of the time and observed their methods of governance, manipulation, and military strategy. One of the most significant diplomatic missions that Machiavelli undertook was a visit to Cesare Borgia, the infamous son of Pope Alexander VI. Borgia was a notorious figure in Italian politics, known for his ruthless methods and Machiavellian tactics in consolidating power. Machiavelli, sent by the Florentine government to observe Borgia's campaigns, was impressed by his pragmatic approach to leadership and his ability to secure power through manipulation and violence. Borgia's use of both cruelty and calculated diplomacy to unify and expand his territories in central Italy provided Machiavelli with a real-world example of many of the themes he would later explore in The Prince. Borgia was a complex character. His ambition and drive to control large swaths of Italy were tempered by his willingness to make and break alliances as needed. He often employed deception, force, and political alliances to further his cause. To Machiavelli, Borgia's actions represented the best and most brutal qualities of a ruler who understood that power could not be gained or maintained through ideals alone. Borgia's pragmatism and readiness to embrace violence, when necessary, became key elements of Machiavelli's philosophy. In particular, Borgia's use of cruelty was a central point of reflection for Machiavelli, who later wrote that a prince should be willing to act immorally if it would help secure his rule. Borgia's political maneuvers provided Machiavelli with a model of the cold, calculated ruler who can manipulate both people and situations to his advantage. Another major diplomatic mission that informed Machiavelli's views was his time spent at the court of Louis XII of France. Louis was a monarch who, like many rulers of the time, was constantly embroiled in the complex political and military struggles of Renaissance Italy. His reign was marked by his efforts to extend French influence in Italy, and Machiavelli had the opportunity to observe how Louis handled diplomacy, warfare, and governance. Louis XII was often seen as a ruler who sought to expand his kingdom through both military conquest and political alliances, using strategic marriages, military engagements, and economic incentives to further his aims. During his time at the French court, Machiavelli would have witnessed the intricacies of diplomacy at play. He saw firsthand how rulers navigated alliances and rivalries, often using marriages or treaties to secure their interests. He also saw the importance of maintaining a balance between military force and political negotiations. These experiences deepened Machiavelli's understanding of power and solidified his belief that rulers must be adaptable, willing to use both diplomacy and force to achieve their objectives. Through these diplomatic missions, Machiavelli came to understand that rulers, regardless of their titles or moral ideals, were often driven by a single pursuit: the consolidation and expansion of power. His exposure to figures like Cesare Borgia and Louis XII solidified his view that the successful ruler must be pragmatic, willing to do whatever it takes to maintain control. These experiences provided the real-world backdrop to his later writings, which sought to dissect the mechanics of power and provide rulers with strategies for success. Machiavelli's time in Florence's diplomatic and military apparatus was critical not only for the knowledge and insight he gained, but also for the personal relationships he developed. His network of contacts, from military commanders to foreign dignitaries, helped him gain a nuanced understanding of the forces that shaped Italy's political landscape. However, this period also marked a significant personal and political downfall. In 1512, the Medici family returned to power in Florence, leading to Machiavelli's dismissal from his post. He was imprisoned briefly and later exiled, an experience that profoundly affected his political worldview and led to the creation of his most famous works. Machiavelli's career in the Florentine Republic, and especially his diplomatic missions, provided him with the raw material for his later writings on power, diplomacy, and leadership. His first-hand experiences with figures like Borgia and Louis XII shaped his ideas about the ruthless and often brutal nature of politics. For Machiavelli, political success was not about idealism or moral virtue. It was about maintaining control, adapting to circumstances, and using both diplomacy and military force to achieve one's goals. These lessons would go on to form the backbone of The Prince and the rest of his political writings, making him one of the most influential political thinkers in history. Niccolò Machiavelli's writing of The Prince was profoundly shaped by the personal, political, and cultural upheavals he experienced during his life in Florence, coupled with the broader political instability of Italy in the early 16th century. His insights into power and leadership, many of which came to define modern political thought, were grounded in a combination of his personal experiences as a public servant, his extensive study of history, and his first-hand exposure to the brutal realities of Renaissance politics. Machiavelli's motivation for writing The Prince stemmed from both a personal need to regain favor after his fall from grace and a deep-seated desire to provide practical advice to rulers on how to maintain power in a world where traditional morality was often irrelevant. After the Medici family regained control of Florence in 1512, Machiavelli, who had been closely involved in the Republican government of the city, found himself out of work, imprisoned, and ultimately exiled. This political downfall was a crucial turning point in his life and provided the context for the creation of The Prince. The fall of the Florentine Republic and the restoration of Medici rule was a humiliating experience for Machiavelli, and it is likely that this personal setback motivated him to write a work that would demonstrate his understanding of power dynamics and offer a guide to rulers on how to avoid the pitfalls that led to his own political disgrace. At its core, The Prince can be seen as Machiavelli's attempt to offer practical wisdom to those in power, showing them how to navigate the often treacherous waters of politics and maintain control in a world that was rarely governed by idealism or morality. The political context of the time was equally influential in shaping Machiavelli's thinking. Renaissance Italy was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own ruler, competing for influence, wealth, and military dominance. Italy was constantly in flux, with alliances and rivalries shifting and foreign powers like France and Spain playing a significant role in Italian politics. In this unstable environment, Machiavelli observed the struggles of rulers who, despite their ambition, often failed to maintain power because they were overly idealistic, too dependent on fortune, or unwilling to take the necessary but ruthless actions to secure their positions. Machiavelli's personal experiences and his study of history, including the rise and fall of ancient Rome, allowed him to develop a sharp, pragmatic view of politics. He recognized that power was not something that could be easily obtained or maintained through virtue alone, but instead required cunning, manipulation, and, at times, cruelty. The creation of The Prince was not merely a response to his own personal situation, but also a reflection of Machiavelli's broader understanding of the political world. In his mind, the political leader, especially one ruling a fragmented and often hostile state, had to be prepared to do whatever necessary to maintain control. This idea became central to the philosophy of The Prince, which advocates for a realistic, sometimes ruthless, approach to governance. One of the central themes of The Prince is the importance of appearance over substance. Machiavelli argues that rulers must carefully craft their public image and project an aura of virtue, even if their actions behind the scenes are far from virtuous. This idea is particularly relevant in today's world, where political leaders, celebrities, and business executives often engage in image management to present themselves as moral, compassionate, and competent. Machiavelli recognized that people judge their leaders based on what they see, not necessarily on the leader's true character. He wrote that a ruler should appear to be merciful, generous, and religious, even if, in reality, these traits were not always present. For example, a ruler might portray himself as a champion of the people, protecting them from the tyranny of other powers, while secretly making decisions that benefit only his own interests. This theme of appearance versus reality is echoed in the famous line from The Prince, in which Machiavelli writes that a prince, therefore, must be very careful not to have a reputation for being fickle or deceitful, but it is necessary for him to be virtuous in a way that benefits him. And if he has to, he should not hesitate to do things that might seem immoral. Essentially, Machiavelli is arguing that rulers must be flexible in their behavior, willing to act in ways that serve their interests, regardless of traditional notions of good or bad. In this sense, Machiavelli's political philosophy is often described as one of realpolitik, where decisions are made based on practical considerations and the harsh realities of power, rather than idealistic moral principles. Another central theme of The Prince is the idea that the ends justify the means. This controversial statement encapsulates much of Machiavelli's philosophy about power. For Machiavelli, the ultimate goal of a ruler is to maintain his power and secure the stability of his state, and any action that furthers this goal is justified, even if it involves deceit, cruelty, or other morally questionable tactics. This concept was radical in its time because it rejected the classical ideal of virtue and instead focused on the necessity of pragmatism and ruthlessness in politics. One of the most famous examples Machiavelli gives in The Prince is the use of cruelty. Machiavelli argues that, while cruelty is never desirable, it may be necessary for a ruler to use force or even violence in certain situations to secure his position. He emphasizes that cruelty should be used in a calculated manner, rather than recklessly, and that it should be administered swiftly and decisively. Machiavelli's famous example of this is Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, who used cruelty and violence to consolidate power in central Italy. Borgia's methods were ruthless, but according to Machiavelli, they were effective in achieving his goals. Machiavelli acknowledges that cruelty can be destructive in the long term, but he argues that if it is used strategically, it can prevent even greater disorder and chaos from taking root. Similarly, Machiavelli discusses the role of deception in leadership. He asserts that rulers must be prepared to deceive when necessary, whether by breaking promises, lying to enemies, or manipulating public opinion. For Machiavelli, deception was a tool of statecraft, just like any other, and should be wielded by rulers when it was in their best interest. He cautioned that a ruler who is too honest and transparent might risk being outmaneuvered by those who are more calculating and willing to use dishonesty to their advantage. Machiavelli's views on manipulation, cruelty, and deception reflect his broader belief that political life is inherently immoral. In The Prince, he does not advocate for the use of these tactics because they are morally justifiable, but because they are effective means to achieve political stability and power. This emphasis on the pragmatics of governance, rather than idealistic notions of virtue, is what has made Machiavelli such a controversial figure throughout history. Machiavelli's discussions of these themes have had a lasting impact on political theory and have influenced leaders and thinkers for centuries. His philosophy in The Prince has been used to justify the actions of ruthless rulers like Napoleon Bonaparte, and it has been cited as an inspiration for both democratic and authoritarian regimes. The notion that power is achieved and maintained through manipulation, strategic cruelty, and the use of deception remains relevant in today's world, where politics is often driven by media, perception, and the willingness to act without regard to traditional ethical constraints. However, it's important to note that while The Prince advocates for the use of these strategies, it also highlights the challenges and dangers of such an approach. Rulers who rely too heavily on manipulation and cruelty risk losing the loyalty and support of their people, and the tactics they use to secure power can backfire in the long run. Machiavelli's insights into the nature of leadership are not meant to offer a simple formula for success, but rather to provide a realistic, often cynical understanding of the complexities of power. Ultimately, The Prince is a work that speaks to the realities of human nature and the often uncomfortable truths about political life. Machiavelli's philosophy was groundbreaking in its directness and its rejection of the idealistic views of power that were prevalent in the Renaissance. His work emphasized the need for rulers to be pragmatic, adaptable, and willing to use any means necessary to protect their power. While his ideas may seem ruthless and even unethical, they continue to resonate with modern leaders and thinkers who must navigate the often murky world of politics. While the pursuit of power and survival often requires difficult and morally ambiguous decisions. The publication of The Prince in 1532 marked a pivotal moment in the history of political thought. As Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince was and still is one of the most controversial books ever written about power, politics, and leadership. The book's raw and unapologetic treatment of political realism, emphasizing that rulers must sometimes act ruthlessly, manipulate public perception, and use deceit to secure power, challenged the idealistic and moralistic ideas that had dominated political theory for centuries. Its reception was immediate and intense, not only because of its content, but also because of its implications for those in power. Initially, The Prince was met with shock and condemnation. The Catholic Church, which was the most powerful religious and political entity in Europe at the time, quickly banned the book. The book's advice to rulers to engage in deception, cruelty, and manipulation was in direct contradiction to the Christian virtues of honesty, mercy, and humility. The Church, which had significant influence over both spiritual and temporal affairs, saw the book as a threat to its authority. The Church's reaction to The Prince was so severe that it included the work on the list of forbidden books, preventing Christians from reading it for more than 2 centuries. The banning of The Prince by the Catholic Church exemplifies the book's inherent subversiveness. In an age when religious morality was central to the legitimacy of rulers, the idea that a ruler should act without regard to traditional ethical standards, employing tactics such as manipulation and violence when necessary, was seen as a profound challenge. Machiavelli's suggestion that the ends justify the means, and that a ruler should be willing to do whatever necessary to maintain power, even if it means acting immorally, was radical and dangerous in the eyes of the Church. The ban also reflects the fear that The Prince would be used to justify tyranny and despotism. Despite the Church's ban, The Prince began to circulate widely throughout Europe, particularly among political and military elites. Its radical message found a receptive audience in the courts and military circles of monarchs and statesmen who were concerned with maintaining their power in a volatile and competitive political environment. The book's influence spread across Europe, and it became a key text in the development of modern political thought. The impact of The Prince was not limited to Italy or even Europe. Over the centuries, the book has been cited by political leaders and revolutionaries around the world as a source of political wisdom. It has been embraced by some of the most ruthless dictators in history, who saw Machiavelli's advice as a guide to maintaining their grip on power. Among the most famous examples of figures who drew inspiration from The Prince are Napoleon Bonaparte and Joseph Stalin. Napoleon, one of the most iconic figures in modern history, was deeply influenced by Machiavelli's ideas on power. Napoleon's rise to power in post-revolutionary France was marked by his use of both military might and political maneuvering. He understood the necessity of controlling public perception, using propaganda to shape his image as the savior of France. Napoleon's ability to manipulate the masses, craft strategic alliances, and use force when necessary mirrored many of the strategies outlined in The Prince. In fact, it is said that Napoleon referred to The Prince as a guidebook for his own reign, taking lessons from Machiavelli's analysis of how to maintain power in a fractured and chaotic political landscape. Similarly, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was heavily influenced by The Prince. Stalin's rise to power was marked by ruthless political maneuvering, violence, and a strategic use of propaganda, all of which align closely with the principles Machiavelli outlined in his work. Stalin's purges, in which millions of people were arrested, exiled, or executed, were a direct reflection of Machiavelli's advice to rulers about the necessity of using cruelty to maintain order and eliminate threats to their authority. Stalin also used propaganda to create a cult of personality around himself, portraying himself as a heroic leader and the savior of the Soviet people. Much like Machiavelli's ideal prince, who cultivates an image of virtue, even if the ruler's actions behind the scenes are far from virtuous. Machiavelli's influence extended beyond authoritarian rulers like Napoleon and Stalin. The book also had a profound impact on revolutionary leaders, who saw the prince as a guide to understanding the dynamics of power and how to challenge established systems. For example, Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, was an admirer of Machiavelli and often cited the prince in his speeches and writings. Mussolini, like many political leaders before and after him, found in Machiavelli's work a roadmap for how to use power effectively, whether through force, persuasion, or manipulation. Even in modern times, the ideas put forth in The Prince continue to resonate with political leaders and strategists. The book's message about the importance of pragmatism, adaptability, and the willingness to use whatever means necessary to maintain power is seen in the strategies of many contemporary political figures. In the world of business, too, The Prince has had a lasting impact, with executives and leaders in the corporate world drawing on Machiavellian principles of manipulation, competition, and strategic alliances to further their goals. The historical impact of The Prince is not limited to those who embraced its ideas, but also includes those who rejected its teachings. Many political philosophers, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, criticized Machiavelli for his cynicism and for advocating what they saw as morally bankrupt tactics. Rousseau, in particular, saw The Prince as a threat to the ideal of republican virtue and the belief that rulers should govern for the common good. Despite this criticism, the fact that The Prince sparked such debate is a testament to its profound influence on political thought. In addition to its influence on political leaders, The Prince has had a lasting impact on academic and intellectual circles. The book is widely regarded as one of the foundational texts of political science, and its themes of power, leadership, and statecraft continue to be studied in universities around the world. The ideas Machiavelli presented in The Prince have influenced the development of modern political theory, particularly in the fields of realpolitik and political realism. Political scientists and philosophers have used Machiavelli's work to explore the dynamics of power, the relationship between ethics and politics, and the nature of leadership. The legacy of The Prince is also evident in the way that the term Machiavellian has entered the lexicon. Today, when someone is described as Machiavellian, it often carries a negative connotation, implying that the person is cunning, manipulative, and willing to engage in unscrupulous tactics to achieve their goals. This popular understanding of Machiavelli's philosophy, however, is somewhat reductive. While it is true that Machiavelli advocates for the use of manipulation and cruelty when necessary, his work is also deeply concerned with the practical realities of governing and the challenges faced by rulers. The Prince is not simply a guide to tyranny, but a nuanced exploration of the difficult decisions that leaders must make in order to maintain power and stability. Machiavelli's influence is so pervasive that even those who disagree with his ideas find it difficult to ignore his impact. The book has been cited by both authoritarian leaders and democratic theorists, by revolutionaries and conservatives, by those who wish to consolidate power and those who seek to dismantle it. The ability of The Prince to speak to such a wide range of political actors speaks to the depth and complexity of Machiavelli's analysis of power. In the 21st century, The Prince continues to be relevant as both a historical document and a guide to understanding the dynamics of power. Its themes of manipulation, appearance versus reality, and the necessity of pragmatism are as applicable today as they were in the 16th century. In a world where political leaders often must navigate a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and public opinion, Machiavelli's insights remain invaluable. Whether it's in the world of politics, business or social movements. The prince provides a blueprint for understanding the ways in which power is acquired, maintained, and lost. The influence of the prince is undeniable. From its initial condemnation and banning by the Catholic Church to its widespread adoption by some of history's most notorious leaders, Machiavelli's work has shaped political thought for centuries. Its legacy lives on in the strategies of contemporary leaders, the analysis of political scientists, and the way we think about power, politics, and leadership. Machiavellian tactics, particularly the cultivation of a virtuous image and the manipulation of public opinion, remain as relevant in modern politics as they were in the Renaissance. Niccolò Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, advocated for rulers to do whatever it took to maintain power, including the use of manipulation, deception, and even cruelty when necessary. One of the most effective tools for maintaining control, according to Machiavelli, was propaganda, shaping how a leader is perceived by the public. This tactic has evolved in the modern political landscape, where public image and media manipulation play pivotal roles in the success of politicians around the world. In the 21st century, the reach and influence of social media and modern communication channels have made it easier than ever for politicians to craft and control their public personas. Machiavelli's insights on power, particularly his views on creating and maintaining a positive public image, remain essential tools for contemporary politicians seeking to secure their position. In the modern world, public image is often as important, if not more important, than actual policy achievements. Politicians spend a considerable amount of time and resources shaping their image to appeal to the electorate. This has been the case for decades, but with the advent of television, then social media, and now 24/7 news cycles, the ability of politicians to control their image and sway public opinion has become an even more powerful tool in the pursuit of power. The art of creating a favorable public image is rooted in Machiavellian principles that go beyond mere appearances, ensuring that the politician is perceived as both virtuous and capable, regardless of their true actions behind the scenes. Machiavelli understood that perception could be more valuable than reality. And this is something that modern politicians grasp with an acute awareness. A well-crafted public persona can be used to obscure a politician's faults and elevate their qualities. For example, many politicians emphasize their role as the protector of the people, projecting an image of compassion and selflessness, even if their policies or actions tell a different story. They might advocate for social welfare or champion the interests of the working class, while simultaneously passing laws or making decisions that primarily benefit the wealthy or corporate interests. The key, as Machiavelli would advise, is to maintain the illusion of virtue, making sure that public opinion remains favorable even when actions might contradict the image being presented. Social media has amplified this phenomenon. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube provide politicians with the tools to create a direct line to the public, bypassing traditional media outlets that could scrutinize their actions more critically. A politician can project an image of themselves that aligns with the values they wish to promote, whether it's being a family person, a champion for the environment, or a strong defender of national security. But behind this image, the politician can simultaneously engage in practices that are far from virtuous, as long as the public's perception remains intact. The craft of political messaging and image control in the digital age mirrors Machiavelli's advice in The Prince that a ruler must appear virtuous, even if they act otherwise in private. In this context, Machiavellian tactics are not just about manipulation of image, but also the manipulation of reality through the control of information. By controlling the narrative, whether through social media posts, speeches, or media coverage, politicians can guide public perception, deflect criticism, and keep their power intact. For instance, a politician might focus on one policy area where they have achieved some success, highlighting it repeatedly in speeches and interviews, while downplaying or ignoring failures in other areas. Through repetition and strategic emphasis, The politician shapes the public perception of their performance and effectiveness. This is a clear example of Machiavelli's point that public opinion can be shaped and manipulated to achieve political objectives. A more extreme, historical example of Machiavellian tactics in modern politics can be seen in the figure of Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953. Stalin's rise to power and his ability to maintain control over the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades involved the strategic use of propaganda, manipulation, and terror, all tactics that Machiavelli would have understood as essential for maintaining power. Stalin, much like Machiavelli's ideal prince, recognized the importance of controlling public perception and used every tool at his disposal to build and sustain a virtuous image while consolidating power. One of the most striking examples of Stalin's use of Machiavellian tactics is his creation of the cult of personality. Stalin carefully crafted an image of himself as a leader who was both infallible and benevolent, a savior of the Soviet people and the architect of the country's transformation. The image of Stalin was carefully constructed through art, propaganda, and public speeches. He was portrayed as a man of the people, a humble worker who had risen through the ranks to become the leader of the nation. Through his public image, Stalin positioned himself as the central figure in Soviet life, above reproach and essential to the survival of the state. One of Stalin's most Machiavellian moves was his strategic manipulation of the Russian people's perception of him as their protector. In the aftermath of World War II, Stalin was widely regarded as a national hero for his role in leading the Soviet Union to victory against Nazi Germany. He used this status to solidify his power, positioning himself as the indispensable leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's manipulation of his image was so effective that it reached the point where his image was omnipresent in Soviet life. Statues of Stalin were erected across the Soviet Union. His face adorned posters, and his words were inscribed on the walls of government buildings. The media continually referred to him as the great leader and father of nations. Even in his personal life, Stalin carefully curated an image of a modest, simple man, in contrast to the lavish lifestyles of other world leaders. But Stalin's virtuous public image was a far cry from his true nature. Behind the scenes, he employed terror, violence, and purges to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his power. Stalin's reign was marked by brutal repression, including the execution and imprisonment of political rivals, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. The Great Purge of the late 1930s, in which Stalin orchestrated the execution of thousands of perceived enemies, is one of the most glaring examples of his Machiavellian approach to power. Stalin's tactics aligned with Machiavelli's advice that a ruler must be willing to use cruelty and terror, if necessary, to maintain control over their subjects and eliminate threats to their rule. One of the key components of Stalin's manipulation was his ability to control information. In a way similar to Machiavelli's prescription for controlling the narrative, Stalin maintained strict control over Soviet media. The press, radio, and all forms of communication were tightly controlled to ensure that only positive messages about the leader and the Soviet state were broadcast to the public. Dissent was not tolerated, and those who spoke out against Stalin or his policies were either silenced or eliminated. Stalin used his propaganda machine to portray his opponents as traitors or enemies of the people, making it impossible for any counter-narrative to gain traction. The cult of personality around Stalin was so effective that even when he made egregious mistakes, such as his disastrous decision to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, or the forced collectivization that led to widespread famine in the Soviet Union, his image remained largely intact. Stalin was portrayed as a wise and all-knowing leader, and any failures were attributed to external enemies or internal sabotage, rather than to his own errors. Machiavelli's insight that a ruler should never let public perception be tarnished, even in the face of failure, was fully embraced by Stalin, who understood the importance of maintaining an image of strength and infallibility. The case of Stalin is a stark illustration of how Machiavellian tactics can be used to consolidate power and manipulate public opinion. Stalin's use of propaganda, his cultivation of a virtuous image, and his readiness to employ terror and cruelty in the pursuit of power all reflect Machiavelli's central themes. Stalin's ability to shape public perception and maintain his rule through fear and manipulation made him one of the most powerful and feared leaders of the 20th century, embodying the very principles Machiavelli described in The Prince. In modern politics, Stalin's use of propaganda and manipulation serves as a cautionary tale, but it also highlights how these Machiavellian tactics remain relevant. Today, the use of social media and mass communication has made it even easier for leaders to control public opinion and build a carefully crafted image, just as Stalin did. Modern politicians often manipulate the media to project an image of strength and infallibility, even when their actions may be far less virtuous than they appear. The manipulation of information, the cultivation of a powerful public persona, and the use of terror or intimidation to suppress dissent are all tactics that continue to play a central role in political leadership around the world. Machiavelli's principles, particularly those concerning the control of public perception and the use of manipulation, remain deeply embedded in the practices of modern politics. From Stalin to contemporary political figures, the lesson remains clear. Power is not just about what you do, but about how you are perceived. By mastering the art of image control and propaganda, a ruler can ensure their continued dominance, regardless of the moral or ethical implications of their actions. Stalin's reign serves as one of the most dramatic examples of Machiavellian tactics in practice, showing just how far a leader can go when they control the narrative, suppress opposition, and use terror to maintain their power. Niccolò Machiavelli's writings, particularly The Prince, offer insights into the complex and often harsh realities of political leadership. While much of Machiavelli's work focuses on the personal qualities a ruler must possess and the ways they must navigate the treacherous waters of political power, he also offered warnings about the use of wealth. In the context of maintaining power, Machiavelli recognized that wealth was an essential tool for a ruler, but he also understood that its use had to be carefully managed. One of the most crucial aspects of Machiavelli's teachings on wealth is his caution against excessive generosity. Machiavelli believed that while a ruler should appear generous and benevolent, they should not overextend themselves by providing too much to the people. Excessive generosity, in his view, could lead to financial ruin and could even erode a ruler's power. A ruler who gives too much risks draining the state's resources, which might result in a situation where the ruler is forced to raise taxes, which in turn breeds resentment among the populace. The lesson here is that wealth should be used strategically, not as a means to win popularity in the short term, but as a tool to ensure long-term stability and control. In The Prince, he famously writes that a ruler should avoid being too generous, because while generosity might win temporary favor, it will eventually lead to demands for more, depleting the ruler's resources and possibly leading to greater instability. This advice on wealth, while situated in the context of Renaissance Italy, is strikingly relevant today, especially when we consider the modern economic landscape. The manipulation of wealth and resources by governments to achieve political aims remains a constant feature of global politics. One of the most common ways that modern governments have manipulated wealth is through inflation, which often occurs when a government prints money to fund various projects. The effects of inflation can be far-reaching, leading to the erosion of public wealth and undermining the economic stability of a country. Inflation, in simple terms, occurs when the supply of money increases without a corresponding increase in the supply of goods and services. When there is too much money circulating in the economy, the value of that money decreases, leading to rising prices. For a government, inflation can be an attractive tool in the short term because it allows the state to raise money without immediately increasing taxes. By printing money, the government can finance large projects, such as infrastructure development or military expenditures, which are often popular with the public. However, as Machiavelli warned, This kind of financial manipulation can have long-term negative consequences. The inflation that results from printing money leads to a decrease in the purchasing power of citizens. As the value of money falls, everyday goods and services become more expensive, and ordinary citizens, particularly those living on fixed incomes, bear the brunt of the economic pressure. The United States is a modern example of a nation that has used inflationary policies to finance large-scale government spending. In recent decades, the U.S. government has engaged in practices such as quantitative easing, which involves the central bank, the Federal Reserve, injecting money into the economy to stimulate growth. While this policy can provide short-term economic relief, it also risks inflating the currency, which leads to the erosion of wealth for everyday citizens. For example, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve began an extensive program of quantitative easing, printing large amounts of money to buy government bonds and other securities in an attempt to keep interest rates low and encourage investment. This, in turn, raised concerns about the long-term impact on inflation. While inflationary policies have been used as a tool to stimulate economic growth, they also come with significant risks. One of the most prominent concerns is that inflation erodes the value of savings. If people's money is losing value due to inflation, their purchasing power decreases, and they are unable to maintain their standard of living. This is particularly detrimental to people who rely on fixed incomes, such as retirees or low-wage workers. Inflation essentially acts as a hidden tax, where the wealth of the public is gradually diminished without a direct increase in government taxes. Historically, hyperinflation has been one of the most extreme manifestations of inflation, and there is perhaps no better example of the destructive power of inflation than the hyperinflation experienced by Germany after World War I. Following the end of World War I, the Weimar Republic in Germany was left with massive war reparations to pay and a shattered economy. In an attempt to meet its obligations, the German government began printing money at an unprecedented rate, leading to hyperinflation. The value of the German mark collapsed, and prices soared out of control. By 1923, the German mark had become virtually worthless. People were required to carry large quantities of currency just to buy basic goods like bread. The effects of this hyperinflation were devastating, as savings were wiped out and the middle class was impoverished. People's trust in the German government and its currency was destroyed, leading to widespread social and political unrest. The hyperinflation in Germany is a stark reminder of the dangers of uncontrolled money printing and the long-term consequences of inflation. It also serves as an illustration of Machiavelli's warnings about the manipulation of wealth and resources. While it may be tempting for a government to use inflation to finance large-scale projects or meet immediate financial obligations, the long-term effects can be catastrophic. Hyperinflation undermines the economy, destroys the wealth of ordinary citizens, and erodes trust in the government's ability to manage the economy effectively. In the case of Germany, the economic collapse caused by hyperinflation paved the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who capitalized on the widespread dissatisfaction with the government to gain political power. The transition from a gold-backed currency system to fiat money has also played a significant role in enabling governments to manipulate economies and control wealth. Under the gold standard, the value of a country's currency was tied to a specific amount of gold, which limited the amount of money a government could print. The gold standard acted as a check on inflation, as governments could only issue as much currency as they had gold reserves to back it. This system worked to stabilize economies by ensuring that money supply was kept in line with the economy's growth. However, in the 20th century, many countries abandoned the gold standard, and today, most economies operate on fiat money systems. Fiat money is currency that has no intrinsic value and is not backed by any physical commodity, such as gold or silver. Instead, the value of fiat money is derived from the trust that people have in the government that issues it. The shift to fiat money allowed governments to print money without the constraints of gold reserves, making it easier to finance spending through the creation of money. While this has given governments greater flexibility in managing their economies, it has also led to a situation where money can be printed at will, often leading to inflation and devaluation of the currency. The ability of governments to print fiat money has allowed them to manipulate economies in ways that were previously impossible. For example, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, engaged in extensive monetary stimulus programs. These programs, such as quantitative easing, involve the creation of large amounts of fiat money to purchase government bonds and other assets. While these policies were intended to stimulate economic growth and avoid deflation, they also had the side effect of increasing the money supply, leading to inflationary pressures. The long-term consequences of fiat money systems and inflationary policies are still being felt today, as governments continue to print money to finance their expenditures. They risk devaluing their currencies and eroding the wealth of their citizens. This has led to growing concerns about the stability of the global economy, as countries with high levels of debt, such as the United States, struggle to maintain their financial positions. The ability of governments to manipulate the money supply through fiat money has created an environment in which inflation can be used as a tool to manage economic conditions, but also carries significant risks. Machiavelli's teachings on the manipulation of wealth and the careful use of resources to maintain power resonate strongly in the context of modern economic policies. His warning about the dangers of excessive generosity and the need for rulers to maintain control over their resources can be applied to the ways that modern governments use inflation and monetary policy to influence their economies. The shift from a gold-backed currency system to fiat money has given governments more power to manipulate the economy, but has also created long-term consequences that affect the wealth and stability of entire populations. Inflation, whether through the printing of money or other means, has the potential to erode wealth, destroy savings, and create widespread economic instability. The lessons from Machiavelli's warnings about wealth are still relevant today, as the manipulation of money remains a central tool for governments seeking to maintain control. However, as history has shown, the long-term consequences of unchecked monetary manipulation can be disastrous. From the hyperinflation of post-WWI Germany to the inflationary pressures seen in modern economies, the misuse of wealth and resources can lead to economic collapse, social unrest, and the erosion of trust in the institutions that are supposed to serve the public good. Machiavelli's insights into wealth and power continue to provide valuable lessons for understanding the dynamics of modern economic systems and the risks of excessive manipulation of the money supply. The future of global power and economic systems is increasingly shaped by alarming trends in national debt, inflation, and government spending. As of recent years, the global debt crisis has become one of the most pressing issues for economies worldwide, particularly for major economies like the United States. The rapid rise in debt, combined with the manipulation of monetary systems, echoes the very warnings that Niccolò Machiavelli issued centuries ago in The Prince. Machiavelli's teachings on the dangers of excessive generosity, the irresponsible use of wealth, and the manipulation of state resources for political gain serve as a stark reminder of the consequences that can arise when governments prioritize short-term political gains over long-term stability. In recent decades, global debt has risen to unprecedented levels. The U.S., in particular, has seen its national debt skyrocket, crossing the $30 trillion mark in 2022 and continuing to grow rapidly. This alarming rise in debt is not limited to the U.S. Many other nations, both developed and developing, are also grappling with unsustainable levels of borrowing. For the U.S., much of this debt has been driven by extensive government spending, particularly in response to crises such as the 2008 financial collapse and the COVID-19 pandemic. In both cases, the U.S. government implemented massive fiscal stimulus packages, injecting trillions of dollars into the economy destabilize markets, and provide relief to citizens. While these measures were necessary to prevent a deeper economic collapse, they have left the country with a significant burden of debt that will be difficult to manage in the long term. This situation reflects the very dangers Machiavelli warned about in The Prince. Machiavelli cautioned that rulers must be careful not to overextend themselves by spending too generously. When a ruler's resources are stretched too thin in an effort to maintain power or to please the populace, the consequences can be dire. Excessive government spending, often used to fund popular social programs, military endeavors, or other costly projects, may generate short-term political gains, but it inevitably leads to long-term financial instability. The classic example of Machiavellian politics, as he discussed in his writings, is the manipulation of resources to secure one's rule without considering the sustainability of those actions. Governments, in their efforts to consolidate power or win favor, often borrow money or print it to finance programs, ignoring the long-term consequences of such financial decisions. The modern world faces the risk of repeating the same mistakes Machiavelli foresaw. Countries around the world have increasingly relied on debt and inflationary policies to fund their operations, leading to a situation where debt becomes a means of buying time, but never truly solving underlying fiscal imbalances. For example, the United States has adopted a policy of borrow now, pay later, funding large projects and national obligations by borrowing money. However, this policy leads to an ever-increasing debt burden, with no clear path for repayment. As the national debt increases, the government becomes increasingly reliant on debt markets and foreign creditors, and the ability to finance its operations through borrowing becomes more difficult. The issue of national debt is further complicated by the manipulation of money supply. The rise of fiat currency systems, which are no longer tied to physical commodities like gold, gives governments the power to print money at will. While this provides short-term relief and economic flexibility, it also poses a serious risk of inflation and currency devaluation. Inflation, driven by the printing of excessive amounts of money, erodes the value of money, making it harder for people to afford goods and services. It also disproportionately impacts the lower and middle classes, who have fewer assets to shield them from inflationary pressures. This process, as Machiavelli warned, is a dangerous game. Governments may be able to manipulate their economies in the short term to maintain power, but the long-term consequences can be catastrophic. The risks associated with rising debt and inflation are not just theoretical. They are very real and tangible. One of the most significant dangers is hyperinflation, a situation where inflation spirals out of control, leading to the rapid devaluation of currency and severe economic instability. The classic historical example of hyperinflation occurred in Germany after World War I. In the early 1920s, the Weimar Republic printed vast amounts of money to pay for war reparations and government expenses. This led to hyperinflation, with the value of the German mark collapsing. By 1923, the currency had become practically worthless, and everyday items like bread became unaffordable. The consequences of hyperinflation were disastrous, causing widespread social unrest, economic collapse, and paving the way for the rise of extremist political movements like the Nazi Party. The modern world is not immune to the risk of hyperinflation. Many countries are vulnerable to this scenario, particularly those that rely heavily on debt financing and printing money to support government expenditures. While hyperinflation may seem like a distant historical example, the global economy is vulnerable to similar crises if current fiscal policies continue. Inflationary pressures are already a concern in many developed economies, including the United States and the European Union, where central banks have engaged in massive money printing operations to stimulate economic growth. If inflation is not carefully managed, it could spiral into a crisis of confidence in the currency and the government's ability to manage the economy. Another risk associated with rising debt and inflation is the potential for economic collapse. If countries are unable to manage their debt burdens or control inflation, they may face a situation where their economies begin to unravel. As the debt burden grows, governments may face difficulties in servicing their debt, leading to defaults or restructuring. This can trigger a chain reaction, affecting financial markets, investment, and consumer confidence. A government default could lead to widespread economic hardship, unemployment, and a loss of faith in the country's financial institutions. We have seen similar scenarios play out in recent decades in countries like Argentina, Greece, and Venezuela, where excessive debt, inflation, and political instability have led to financial collapse and widespread social unrest. The risk of societal unrest is another potential consequence of rising debt and inflation. When the cost of living rises due to inflation and people's wealth is eroded, social tensions increase. People begin to lose faith in their government's ability to manage the economy, and protests, strikes, and civil unrest become more common. History has shown that economic instability often leads to political instability as people become disillusioned with the existing system. In the worst-case scenario, social unrest can lead to political upheaval, revolutions, or the rise of authoritarian regimes that promise stability and control in exchange for power. The future of global economies, if current fiscal practices continue, appears uncertain and fraught with risks. If governments continue to rely on debt and inflationary policies to fund their spending, they risk undermining their own economic stability. The inevitable consequences of excessive debt and inflation, hyperinflation, economic collapse, and societal unrest could lead to a situation where governments lose control of their economies and their populations. In such a scenario, Machiavelli's warnings about the dangers of excessive generosity and reckless spending resonate more than ever. Machiavelli's final warning in The Prince about the dangers of a ruler who spends excessively to maintain power is particularly relevant today. In The Prince, he famously writes, "A prince who is too generous will be ruined." This warning highlights the precariousness of relying on excessive spending and the manipulation of resources to maintain political control. While short-term spending can be used to secure political support, it inevitably leads to long-term financial instability. Governments that prioritize political expediency over fiscal responsibility risk undermining their own power and inviting economic collapse. Machiavelli also understood the importance of balance, being generous enough to maintain loyalty, but not so generous that it drains the state's resources. The lesson is clear. A ruler must exercise caution when it comes to spending, ensuring that their decisions are sustainable in the long term. As we look to the future, it is crucial to learn from history and avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. The rise of global debt, the manipulation of money supply, and the risks associated with inflation are all reminders of the fragile nature of economic systems. Machiavelli's teachings offer valuable lessons on the importance of prudence, caution, and foresight when it comes to managing wealth and power. If governments continue down the path of excessive debt and inflationary policies, the consequences could be dire, leading to economic collapse, hyperinflation, and societal unrest. By heeding Machiavelli's advice on the careful management of wealth and resources, we can work to avoid these risks and ensure long-term stability and prosperity. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From Machiavelli's dark insights on power and the use of wealth to maintain control, to the terrifying implications of hyperinflation and economic collapse. One thing is clear: his warnings were not just for rulers of the past. They resonate deeply with the challenges we face today. What we've learned is that economic manipulation, the reckless handling of national debt, and the uncontrolled printing of money are strategies that could destabilize nations, ruin economies, and lead to widespread unrest, just as Machiavelli predicted centuries ago. And if we're not careful, history could repeat itself. Machiavelli's teachings still offer us invaluable lessons, not just for understanding power, but for navigating our own future. As we continue to see rising debt and inflation, we must ask ourselves, Are we following the same dangerous path that led to chaos in the past? It's crucial to be aware of the risks, both economic and political, that could threaten our global stability. But there's hope. By reflecting on these lessons, we can begin to take control of our economic futures and avoid the pitfalls that have doomed past civilizations. If you found today's discussion eye-opening and thought-provoking, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We've only just scratched the surface, and there's so much more to explore. Share this video with your friends and family. Let's start a conversation that needs to happen. Together, we can bring awareness to these critical issues and make a real difference. And, as always, if you'd like to support the channel and keep these deep dives coming, click the super thanks button below. Your contribution helps us keep creating content that challenges the status quo and empowers viewers like you. Thank you for joining us today. The future of global power is in our hands. And by understanding the lessons of history, we can ensure it's a future we all have a stake in. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep questioning the world around you.